The Canadian Constitution Foundation, also known as the CCF, puts out a weekly podcast called Not Reserving Judgment. A couple of days ago, I watched episode 85, aired on March the 14th, 2025, titled Police Use Drones to Film Drivers, plus Non-Indigenous Banned from BC Beach. This title caught my attention because I am a non-Indigenous Canadian living in BC and I like to walk on the beach. So let's hear what Joanna Baron, Executive Director of the CCF, has to say.
Mine is a spicy one. So Parks Canada just banned non-Indigenous people from Long Beach in Tofino, British Columbia, more or less indefinitely, so that a whale who died can be honored, dissected, and ceremoniously harvested by Indigenous people only.
Wow, so much misinformation in such a small time interval. It's almost impressive. Well, here are the facts. On May 7, 2025, a dead gray whale washed up on Long Beach near Tofino, BC. On May 10, 2025, Parks Canada issued a notice closing the beach until further notice. The beach was closed to the general public. Period. Parks Canada did not specifically exclude non-Indigenous people from the beach. The closure was made in accordance with Section 36, subsection 1 of the National Parks General Regulation. The closure ended on May the 12th, 2025, and it was a total of 3 days. According to the notice, the reason for the closure was for National Park Reserve management purposes, visitor safety, and Indigenous cultural protocols. Parks Canada also issued a statement as follows. Parks Canada, Tlaquequit First Nations, and Fisheries and Oceans Canada, DFO, are working together to respectfully respond to a whale carcass found within the Tlaquequit territory of the hereditary chiefs on Long Beach within Pacific Rim National Park Reserve. On Saturday, May 10th, Tlaquequit will hold a private ceremony. DFO will lead a necropsy on the same day. Final results from this analysis may take up to 3 months. There may be other activities taking place over the coming days. The Tlaquequit First Nations are the indigenous stewards of the tribal park on which the whale carcass was located. Parks Canada articulates their joint management of the Pacific Rim National Park Reserve as follows. Since 1995, Parks Canada has been working collaboratively with First Nations to achieve long-term conservation and sustainable use of natural and cultural resources within Pacific Rim National Park Reserve. This provides an enriched sense of place for visitors and the local communities. So, by including First Nations in a cooperative joint management of the Pacific Rim National Park Reserve, Parks Canada's goal is to enrich the experience of park visitors. That is the fundamental and laudable mandate of any park. The Tlaquequit Nation is one of 9 First Nations with stewardship in the Pacific Rim National Park Reserve. Their particular nation has been tasked with the responsibility of managing Long Beach along with Parks Canada. In accordance with their mandate, on May the 10th, 2025, the Tlaquequit First Nations held a ceremony on the cultural harvesting of the whale. Only members of the Tlaquequit First Nations were permitted to the whale site for the ceremony. I assume that it is this exclusion of non-Tlaquequit members that is the ban of non-Indigenous people that Ms. Baron is referring to. Let's continue.
Now, let's be clear, honoring dead whales is beautiful and ceremonial practices deserve our respect.
I have to stop here. Throughout her entire diatribe, Ms. Baron does not even acknowledge Tlaquequit First Nations as the Indigenous stewards of Long Beach. Instead, she lumps together all Indigenous people, giving the appearance that she is unaware of the unique histories, languages, cultural practices, and spiritual beliefs that are woven into the fabric of Canada's Indigenous people. Or she doesn't care. Given the damning omission, I doubt very much that Miss Baron has any idea of how the ceremonial honoring of dead whales is done, let alone that it is beautiful. In fact, the Tlaquequit website describes the experience as smelly, messy, and greasy. It may have a spiritual beauty, I don't know, and I'm not going to pretend that I do. What Ms. Baron is doing here is feigning appreciation for an indigenous cultural practice by calling it beautiful without the first idea of what it is or of its actual significance. If she truly appreciated Indigenous culture and the diversity of the First Nations, she would have made the effort to research the Tlaloquet First Nation and, in particular, their role in the stewardship of Long Beach and the symbiotic relationship that they have with Parks Canada and the people of Tofino. Certainly, she would have acknowledged the Tlaloquet First Nation by name at least once.
But this isn't about ceremony. It's about effectively state-enforced race-based exclusion on public land.
This closure was not a case of race-based exclusion. It was for the purpose of letting Parks Canada, Tlaloquet First Nations, and Fisheries and Oceans Canada deal with the whale carcass, partly in accordance with Tlaloquet protocols, partly with the need for Fisheries and Oceans Canada to perform a necropsy, and partly because the decomposing whale carcass presented a potential threat to visitor safety. Tlaloquet First Nations and Parks Canada did not ban non-indigenous people. All people who are not Tlaloquet First Nations members were banned. That included members of other 8 nations within the stewardship of the Pacific Rim Park Reserve, as well as every other non-Tlaloquet Indigenous person. According to the Tlaloquet First Nations website, they have about 1,200 members. There are about 1.8 million Indigenous people in Canada. That means that 99.9% of all Indigenous Canadians were also excluded from the ceremony. Yet Ms. Baron makes no mention of them and frames this as an exclusive ban of all non-Indigenous people. It is reasonable for the Tlaloquet First Nations to exclude people that are not members of their nation. Their particular nation has the duty of attending to whale carcasses in that particular area. I'm assuming that the task needs to be done properly and in coordination with government agencies. They are the nation that is familiar with that area, and they have a working relationship with the local government officials. They have a duty to perform, and their younger, less experienced members will benefit from this opportunity to learn and practice this duty for future occurrences. What they don't need is a bunch of looky-loos getting in the way, Indigenous or otherwise. So everyone who is not a member of the Tlaloquet First Nations was banned. It was not an exclusion based on race. It was an exclusion based on the need to keep unauthorized and unqualified people from getting hurt and or interfering with the task at hand.
Which raises a constitutional problem. So this is obviously a problem for Section 15.1, which mandates equality under the law. And there may be a justification under Section 15.2, which allows the state to take action sort of in affirmative action broadly. But let's look at how we would look at this under Section 1, because even if a law violates rights under the Charter, it still might be saved under Section 1 if it's a reasonable limit that is demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. But to do that, the government has to prove that the infringement is pressing and substantial, rationally connected to the objective, minimally impairing, and overall proportionate. So let's look at a few of these. So is it a pressing objective? Sure. Supporting Indigenous cultural practices, that's legitimate. Rational connection, closing the whole beach area to create space indefinitely for a private ceremony. I would say that'd be reasonable for a day or two, maybe, but that's not what's happening. Minimally impairing is where we get into some real problems because the closure is not narrow in scope, time, or application. It's not just for the ceremony or even a series of ceremonies. And Parks Canada could have closed the beach to everyone besides Indigenous people for the few hours of the ceremony. They could have restricted access just to around the actual whale. They could have created viewing areas at a respectful distance, but instead they created a blanket indefinite exclusion, and non-Indigenous Canadians in fact face fines for up to $25,000 just for walking on a public beach in a national park under federal law. So that's not reconciliation, that's effectively a type of segregation.
As I've said, this was not a case of race-based exclusion. So Section 15 of the Charter does not come into play here. But for the sake of discussion, let's assume that Section 15 applies. The most gaping and obvious hole in Ms. Baron's argument is the fact that the closure was for 3 days. It was lifted on May the 12th, 2025, and this podcast aired on May the 14th, 2025. If I cut Ms. Baron some slack and assume that she didn't know the ban had been lifted, that hardly excuses her. Her exact words were that Park Canada created a blanket indefinite exclusion. Making that kind of allegation without checking its veracity is grossly irresponsible. In any event, the fact that the ban was initially until further notice is commonplace and reasonable. There are likely a lot of things that can go wrong with dealing with a decomposing whale carcass, and it would be unreasonable to expect Parks Canada to know with exact precision when it would be safe to return to the beach. It is laughable that Ms. Baron presumes to second-guess Parks Canada by suggesting they could have closed the beach to everyone besides Indigenous people for the few hours of the ceremony, or that they could have restricted access to just around the actual whale, or that they could have created viewing areas at a respectable distance. A decomposing whale carcass creates a safety issue. They attract predators, including bears, cougars, and wolves. Also, apparently, decomposing whales can actually explode. Finally, expecting Parks Canada and the Tla'aque'it First Nations to engage in added task of crowd control is patently unreasonable. So for all of those reasons, yes, cordoning off a wide area around the whale until further notice was a demonstrably justifiable measure in these circumstances. But what I find most egregious is Miss Baron's reference to a $25,000 fine that will be levied against non-Indigenous Canadians for walking on a public beach just so she can blow the dog whistle words of reconciliation and segregation. As I pointed out, the ban applies to everyone. The Tla'aque'it First Nations were given some authorization to enter the restricted area. However, if an unauthorized Tla'aque'it member had been on the restricted area outside of the authorized time for the ceremony, that person would have been subject to the same fines as us non-Indigenous folks. It's almost as if Miss Baron did not read the Parks Canada notice before appearing in the podcast.
So I think even if the intentions are good, intentions don't cure unconstitutional conduct. We've also seen a similar move in Joffrey Lake Provincial Park outside of Vancouver for a few months to allow Indigenous people to observe traditional practices. The
Joffrey Lake closure is a separate issue. Joffrey Lake Provincial Park is about 190 kilometers north of Vancouver. There are ongoing discussions over the disputed Joffrey Lake lands. The closure is for 3 weeks, and it was done for the joint purpose of avoiding overuse of the park, and so members of the Lil'wat Nation and Naquatka can reconnect with the land and carry out cultural and spiritual practices. It has become an issue for some whiny non-Indigenous malcontents, but that is a video for another day.
I think this is a miss. Reconciliation is not about punishing people for who they are, but about building shared frameworks where everyone's rights can be respected. And Parks Canada, you missed the mark.
And there it is, the real point to this grossly fallacious diatribe. Reconciliation is unfairly punishing us poor non-Indigenous folks. Oh, woe is us. When will the persecution stop? Boo-hoo-hoo. What will we do? What will we do? Seriously, though, does anyone really believe that the Tla'aque'it First Nations conspired with Parks Canada in coming to a diabolical plan for a 3-day closure of Long Beach to non-Indigenous Canadians and apparently 99.9% of Indigenous Canadians as a punishment for more than a century of abuse suffered by Indigenous children in residential school gulags? Seriously? To all my fellow non-Indigenous brethren, if you feel your non-Indigenous rights are being violated or that you are being punished for being non-Indigenous, stop, think, do some research before you publicly embarrass yourself by opening your big, whiny, non-Indigenous mouth. That's this rodent's take on Miss Baron's uninformed, petty, and small-minded outrage on Parks Canada's decision to close Long Beach to the public for 3 days. Miss Baron's nonsensical rant against Parks Canada is very aptly described as
bad legal take indeed.
I'm the pensive beaver, I live on Vancouver Island, and I have a lot on my mind, and I've just given you a piece of it. Now it's only fair that you give me a piece of yours. Now I'm just going to relax, chew on some bark, and enjoy my backyard. You're welcome to join me.